So, this is a comment that I had on the last video that I made talking about fairy government. And the comment was basically, do people perceive the good folk around them to be similar to the way their own society is, the human society is, because they are perceiving them and understanding them in the only really way possible? I'm obviously badly paraphrasing the comment right there. It was a little more coherent than I just put it. So basically, do humans perceive the good folk as having a society or a culture that is similar to the society and culture of the humans, because that's the easiest way for those humans to understand these beings? And instead of responding with a comment to the comment, I figured I would make a video, because this is actually a surprisingly complicated topic. So, to begin with, I should say, this is one of those philosophical questions. It's like a Zen koan. There's no way for us to know for certain what the answer to this actually is. We'll never know, most likely, unless we all start living out the plotline of an urban fantasy book and all supernatural folkloric beings reveal themselves to humanity. But assuming that doesn't happen, we will probably never know the actual answer to this. We can only sort of theorize. So we have this huge body of folklore. We have all of this folk material which tells us how people historically, over the last 1,000 or so years, have interacted with and perceived these different types of beings. And generally that gives us this pattern which says that usually the people that are interacting with these beings are encountering something society, culture-wise, that is very similar to what those people themselves have or are familiar with. Sometimes a couple generations removed, like we do have a lot of accounts that talk about people encountering the good folk who are wearing clothing that would have been popular a few generations before among humans. We have anecdotal accounts, stories of people who travel to the world of fairy or visit the world of fairy and encounter these sometimes what would be contemporaneous cities or towns, places that would have seemed like they were from that human's world and time period. But also sometimes people encounter things that seem a little bit archaic. And that is sort of a separate topic of conversation, because we've seen that increasing in the 20th and the 21st century, where people are more likely to encounter things that seem, from our perspective, historic as opposed to contemporary. And the contemporary is what we used to find in accounts. Now there's this sort of romanticized anachronism that goes on around fairies. This idea that the good folk are somehow living in this idealized version of particularly medieval human times. So we have a lot of this material, and we have a lot of material certainly that indicates that when humans are interacting with these beings, and stories and anecdotes, what have you, that they are encountering them in a way that is familiar. We only have very few accounts where people interact with or perceive these beings as extremely foreign, even to the point of language. Generally, when you encounter one of the good folk, it's going to be speaking most likely a version of a language that you're familiar with. We only have a very few accounts that talk about them using languages that the human isn't familiar with, but usually still those would be languages that would be locally in use. So, for example, in the Isle of Man, there's an account of someone who only speaks English encountering the good folk, and they were only speaking Manx, so they had a bit of a communication difficulty, if you will. We also have accounts, Reverend Robert Kirk, for example, talks about how the fairies, the good folk, have their own language, and that people have described it as being just very inhuman, kind of in nature, sort of describing it as whistles I think is how Kirk describes it. So for the most part, the material that we have kind of reinforces this idea that the good folk, the fairies, are very similar to humans, but not humans. That they're similar to humanity, but sort of a step sideways, if you will. However, as the comment on the video mentioned, it is entirely possible that that is only because humans are perceiving them in the only ways they can understand. Or to put it another way, that the humans in the encounter are making a lot of assumptions based on what they're seeing. If you see one of the good folk and they're wearing something that you perceive to be sort of medieval human clothing, is it actually, or is it something else? Is it the good folk's own fashion? We don't know. The same thing with the language issue. Are they even actually verbally speaking? We assume so in the stories. That's sort of how it's presented. But these are beings that are not human, that are not native, I guess we would say, to the human world. They're spirits in some sense. We know for a fact from a ton of folkloric material that these are beings who have a type of magic. It's often referred to as glamour, which can fool all of the human senses, all of them. Smell, sight, hearing, touch, everything. We have multiple stories sort of across the Celtic language speaking cultures of people going to a feast with the good folk, and at some point something happens that awakens the human to the real situation, and they realize that this sort of sumptuous feast they've seen laid out before them is actually like detritus from the forest floor, like leaves and acorns and sticks and things. In at least one account from Lady Wilde, the feast was a human corpse. A little more grim with that one. And certainly we have many accounts in the stolen midwife stories where the midwife is taken to what she perceives to be this grand palace, is physically interacting with everything around her in the process of helping this other woman give birth. But then when anointing the baby's eyes with this ointment that's provided by the father, she accidentally touches usually one of her own, and then suddenly can see the reality that she's in. Usually it's described as like a dark cave, and that nothing that she had seen up to that point is true or real or actually there. So knowing that we have this ability among the fair folk, this is something that's really well established across the breadth of the folklore, really Western European folklore. It gets really tricky to say for sure whether humans who encounter these beings, who, when we get these stories from, are actually seeing or hearing or smelling or touching or what have you, what they think they are, or if they are just perceiving what makes the most sense to them in that situation. If they're being given something false to perceive by these beings. And this also gets us kind of sideways into the wider argument that goes on between the fairy folklore community and the ufologist community as to whether modern fairy abductions and fairy encounters are the same as modern alien abductions and alien encounters, UFO encounters, and which of those is actually accurate. So, and you will see this argument. Joshua Cutchin describes it in great detail in his books, particularly A Trojan Feast, but also Thieves in the Night, talking about the fact that there's a huge amount of overlap between what we would call, I guess, UFO folklore and fairy folklore and encounters, and that these encounters between these two different things tend to be extremely similar in how they actually occur, to the point where you could take out the word fairy or the word alien and sort of switch them or replace them, and it wouldn't change the story at all. So people in the ufologist community tend to argue that older fairy encounters and fairy folklore are just people encountering aliens, extraterrestrials, without any context for it prior to the modern era, and therefore saying it's fairies. Whereas many people, in my experience in the fairy-oriented folklore community, tend to have argued the exact opposite point, that modern UFO and alien encounters are just fairies using glamour, using that illusion magic to present themselves in a new way that is more acceptable or familiar to the humans they're encountering. It basically comes down to, are the good folk just giving us what we want or what we expect? And we can also get into this argument around the idea of fairies having wings, because of course, as I've mentioned before in previous videos, the good folk in traditional folklore do not have wings. They fly through other means, no wings. The wings really don't come in until the last 100 years in artwork, and they came into artwork just as a way to visually signal this is a fairy, as opposed to this is just a pretty human or what have you. And once it came into artwork, and then it came into fiction around the beginning of the 20th century, and then from there, it became wildly popularized and found its way into not belief initially, but what we could describe as people trying to write about or describe fairies, sort of mid-20th century. And then by the end of the 20th century, getting into the 1970s, 1980s, we start to find anecdotal accounts. We start to see people saying, yes, I saw a fairy and it was small and it had wings. And that's a pretty radical change, really, from all of the older material we have across most of a continent or more, and hundreds of years. Why do they all of a sudden have wings? One possible answer to that is they all of a sudden have wings because the humans who are seeing them are expecting them to have wings. And once you have an audience primed with a certain expectation, that is what they're more likely to encounter. But again, this gets back into the answerless question. Is it because the good folk themselves are changing and adapting, evolving, we might say? Do they feed off of, in some sense, what humans believe, which some people think that they do? Or are they not changing? Are they continuing to remain as they have always been? But they are giving people who encounter them what that human expects. And this is a really complicated question. Like I said, there's no real answer to it. There certainly does seem to be some kind of symbiotic relationship between humans and the good folk and the way that the folklore and the beliefs kind of shape themselves. There also seems to be some sort of mimicry that goes on, where the good folk do tend to appear dressed in human clothing, human style clothing, living in ways that are somewhat familiar, at least to the humans around them. We discussed last time the whole government concept. So it's a little hard to know, as the humans in the equation, whether or not this is because the good folk themselves, if we're taking them as an objective reality, are imitating and mimicking humans and sort of adapting their own society to that, or is it just because we always get whatever our expectation is, and the folklore is what generally informs most people's expectations? So if your expectation is that you are going to encounter beings that are fit a certain physical description, act a certain way, well, maybe not act a certain way, I'll circle back to that in a second, but fit a certain physical description, have certain abilities, have a certain type of connection to the human communities around them, are you more likely to get that because you expect it? And there's evidence in both directions, quite frankly. We do have a lot of stories, of course, that reinforce the existing folklore, which would support the idea that the folklore shapes belief, people get what they believe. On the other hand, we do have encounters, we do have anecdotal material and stories of people who were not believers, who had experiences that were vastly at odds with what they expected. For example, I have talked to people who had a certain expectation that the good folk would be nice and friendly, and caring, and sort of along the lines of sort of the modern Disney-fied twee fairies, and instead ran into problems, and in some cases even were injured because what they were interacting with was in fact not that, did not fit that expectation. So there's support for both sides, I think, which is why we'll probably never have an answer to this question. And that was what I wanted to get back to, talking about the behavior, that sometimes people do get what they expect behavior-wise, but probably about half the time, I think, in the material I've looked at, people get behavior that they did not expect. Sometimes just sort of inexplicably strange behaviors. Sometimes it's dangerous when they expect it not to be. A few rare occasions, it's not dangerous when they expect it to be. So it's a complicated subject, really, is what it all comes down to. And there's also sort of the argument with all of this that potentially we are getting what we expect because that's the best way for them to manipulate us. That the good folk give humans what the humans expect because, in fact, they have something that they need from that human, whether it's belief in them or acknowledgement or offering some milk and cream. There's a lot of potential there. I will say that in quite a few instances where I've talked to people or helped people who had problems with the good folk, it usually follows a pattern where the person initially encounters the being and perceives them to be helpful or friendly or interested in the human in some sort of positive sense. And then they sort of get entangled with this spirit, only to find out that in fact there are some nefarious motives going on. And usually at that point, it becomes a significant problem for the human. So, very complicated subject. I do think that we also have to keep in mind that our perceptions are always going to be limited by our expectations, whether or not it is true that they give us what we expect, or we actually are seeing some sort of objective truth and reality with all this. If you have an expectation that they have a queen, for example, and you are in a situation where you see what seems to you to be a queen, and that's all the information you have, just what you're seeing, most people are then going to make an assumption that that is what they're seeing, and then it gets passed on in stories. And I do think sometimes that assumptions work their way in to the way that people tell the stories, because that's just how humans work. A lot of the human mind is based on predicting or expecting things from assumptions. It's just the nature of how the human mind is. So that is certainly a factor. I will also say that what complicates this subject greatly, if you look at the older material, there is a lot of cohesiveness to it. Older folklore, meaning up until like the 70s or 1970s, 1980s. There's a lot of cohesion to it, whether we're talking about Ireland, whether we're talking about Newfoundland, wherever we're talking about. Communities tended to sort of have this self-reinforcing idea of what these beings were, shared stories, shared concepts. Now, as we get into the later 20th century and the 21st century, that does not hold true as much. So, and this is also, I should say, part of why in the last video I really didn't want to get into the modern 21st century beliefs, because it gets very messy. When we look at the older material, we can make statements about who the good folk are, what they look like, what they generally seem to do, because we have this broad array of beliefs, but generally those beliefs are fairly cohesive. So if we want to talk about who the Aishi are, who the people of the fairy hills in Ireland are, we can look at this bulk of material, and there's some very clear patterns that we can see that allow us to make general statements. The problem when we get into the modern material, the 21st century material, particularly outside of cultures that still have that cohesive community belief, is we find a lot of people who are putting out material which, is coming from their own experiences, their own anecdotal material, their own personal beliefs, and none of that is a bad thing. I don't want to imply that it is. But they make very definitive statements about who the fairies are, what the fairies are, how fairy society works. And a lot of times, each individual human who is putting this forward is saying something that is completely different from all of the folklore we have previously and from the other humans who are writing about this in the 21st century. So we don't have that cohesive picture anymore. You might find one person who channels messages from the fairies, talking about how the fairies are environmental warriors, that they're all about the protection of the earth, and that they want humans to wake up and start protecting the world around them. You might find someone else who is also saying that they are channeling messages from these beings, but they are describing these beings as sort of a enlightened spiritual guide for humanity who just want to help humans be better humans and help humans to spiritually evolve to higher levels. And then you might have another person who also saying, that they're channeling these messages, that they've had these experiences and encounters, but then they're describing beings that are interested in, reincarnating into a human body, that these are beings who want to experience the human world and interact with humans and live among humans and all this other stuff. And I'm not saying any of these in a judgmental way. I might have my personal opinions on some of them, but these are all things that are out there. These are all things that people believe. These are all experiences that these people genuinely, have had, or, or at least putting out there that they've had. But they're extremely different in their nature, in their tone, in their message. And it's very hard to sort of look at all of that and find any clear patterns beyond the fact that, clearly there are different groups of these beings, fairies, whatever we want to call them, that seem to be reaching out to people, because we do have many people now who are relaying messages for them or communicating, in their name, as it were. But it's not like we're talking about one single voice that is right. We have all of these different voices and all of these different messages, often framed as if they're coming from the fairies in a general sense, but clearly coming from like a specific group, let's say, and then filtered through the understanding and the perspective and the assumptions of whatever human is then relaying these messages. And it gets very messy and very confusing and very contradictory. Not to say the older folklore cannot also be contradictory, because it can, definitely, in a lot of places. But there's so much more of it, and it's material that has been passed on and survived and is believed by groups of people. So it's a little easier to work with that and to sort of explain it and make it feel more cohesive, as opposed to what we have now in the last 10 years or so, which is just a lot, kind of all over the place. Some with some very clear human-oriented messages, often political types of messages, environmentalist types of messages. And trying to look at all of that and add that into this question of, are we perceiving them as they actually are, or are we getting what we expect from them because it's what we expect from them? I think that is definitely a question that really needs to be taken into account when we're looking at the modern material. Again, not to discount it. I'm not saying throw it all out because it's so individualized now, but definitely, take into account if you have a person, for example, who has, their whole life been very heavily involved in environmentalism and saving the earth and saving the planet and all of that. And then they're coming forward and saying that they have these messages from the fairies that are exactly the same as what the humans' philosophy already was. Save the earth, save the planet. It's not to discount that those messages may or may not be genuine, but you definitely have to take into account that they are things that human was already very passionate about. And on the one hand, we can argue that that would be why that particular group, if you will, of the good folk chose that human to put those messages out there. But we also have to take into account that that human could be, to some degree, distorting the messages or experience that they're having because of their expectations. And I'm mentioning all of this, and I'm not meaning to focus too much on just the modern period, but I'm mentioning all of this because I think it really is important to the original question of, are we getting what we expect, or are we perceiving what is actually there? And I think ultimately for myself, the answer is probably a blend of both. I do think that humans have genuine encounters and genuine experiences objectively, as much as possible. It's such a subjective thing. But I also think that the human having the experience is going to inevitably affect both how that story then gets told and how the experience is perceived. And those are all things that we sort of have to consider. So it's not so much a matter of straightforward, either the human is telling the truth and this is accurate, or the human is not telling the truth and this is false. It's much more nuanced than that. It gets complicated on every level. And this is true of the older material as well, as I said. But the older material, it's easier because we have so much of it. And when you have dozens and dozens and dozens of stories that are very similar and kind of with the same message, if you will, the same sorts of experiences, we can kind of conclude, I think, that there's a pattern there and that this is something that is genuinely a thing people are experiencing in some sense. When we have all of this sort of scattered various experiences that don't have that cohesion, it's a lot more complicated to try to find any patterns going on with it. Besides, obviously, the overarching people are coming forward with messages, and people do still have fairy encounters and experiences. So time will tell what happens with the modern range of experience. But I think looking at all of this together gives us that answer of, it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. Are people having experiences? I mean, that seems clear. This is a phenomenon that's occurred for pretty much all of written human history. At least it's been recorded for that long. And we also know that, what people expect to some degree is at least going to affect how they perceive the experience and how they tell the story of the experience. And that is all going to affect the end result. So ultimately, we will probably never know, like I said, unless, we all start living out the plotline of urban fantasy and all these beings just come forward and start living in the human world on the daily, as it were. But most likely, we will never know for sure. So it's also sort of on each of you as individuals to decide what you do believe and what you don't believe and what ideas you're comfortable with when it comes to this subject. Because we have some wider patterns. We have enough to say, yeah, there's definitely something going on here. And then we have a lot of diverse opinions and ideas that it gets very complicated to sort of weave together, particularly in the last 10 and 20 years. Things have gotten very chaotic, kind of appropriately enough for this subject. Chaotic recently, as opposed to the older material. Now, I think I've mentioned this in previous videos. I have myself had personal experiences. I study this from a more academic angle because it helps me give context to that and helps me understand what is going on and what I'm dealing with. But even for me, even from my experiences, I will admit that there is always going to be that angle of assumption and perspective that affect how I describe things, how I remember stories, how I tell them, how I had a particular experience, like in that experience, how I reacted and what happened is going to also be affected by this. So it's sort of one of those things that is just an aspect of this subject. Um, do we know for sure? Absolute objective truth, what these beings are, what they look like, where they live, what their culture's like? No, we don't. We just don't. We have a lot of material to work with and look at that can give us some really strong ideas. And again, I particularly focus on the older folklore because that's material that has stood the test of time, so to speak. But the newer material, I think, also does have value. We just have to keep in mind how individualized it's gotten, and that each person, myself included, who talks about a fairy experience is not talking about it in a completely objective fashion, because that's impossible. Humans just don't work that way. We're always bringing our own assumptions and ideas and expectations to anything. And then also when we tell the story, even if someone is being 100% honest with what happened to them, it's still going to be colored by all of those same things. It's still going to be affected by what they were assuming during the experience and what they believe happened. And this would be true outside of folklore, even if we were just talking about, if I'm telling you a story about hanging out with my best friend last week, that is also going to be affected by all of these same things. Again, it's just how humans work. Humans are not really objective creatures. Just the way the psychology of the human mind is, everything is subjective, and our reality, our consensual reality, is still in our own perception based on all of these things, these assumptions and perspectives and all of the rest of that. So when we take that and then put it into a subject like fairies, obviously there's going to be a lot of diversity and a lot of opinions and a lot of ideas. And this is not the sort of thing where we can really tangibly prove anything, at least in a group context. Like as an individual, I might feel that things have been proven or that certain things are unquestionable, but that is not an objective thing that can be shared. It's not like proving that gravity exists, which is fairly easy to do, even if you don't understand physics or much about the wider concept. This is a different sort of topic. So lots of opinions, lots of perspectives. Is there an underlying objective truth there? I think so, and I think that we can at least sort of argue based on the bulk and the length of the folklore. But how well or how poorly do we actually understand these experiences and encounters of these beings? That is a huge gray area. And I just think we will never really know for sure. The best we can do, which is what I try to do in these videos, is present the bulk of the material that we have and what conclusions we can draw from that material. And the more we have, the more stories we have, the more experiences we have, the more anecdotes people share, the more we have to work with in kind of shaping this picture, if you will. So I realized I got very long and a little bit tangential in the middle, but hopefully it at least explains a little bit better why this subject is as complicated as it is, and why we will never be able to answer the question of, when you have an encounter with a fairy, are you actually objectively understanding it as it is, or are you only perceiving what you choose to perceive or what you expect to perceive? The eternal question. So I will leave you on that note. Any additional comments or questions, just put them in the comments on this video and I will try to address them. Have a good day, everyone.